Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the Divine Reality course. We're continuing with a section on, or where we're analyzing whether science proves atheism or or does science disprove God. We are addressing these questions, engaging these questions, inshallah. And in the previous session, we briefly discussed or started to highlight some of the limitations of the scientific method. And now we're continuing. And one of the other limitations we're going to first look at here is that science cannot answer the why behind things, the why question, right? It can address the how. We can analyze the physical world, look at certain aspects of the physical world, say for example rain clouds, right? If we're studying rain clouds, the scientists can spend years studying rain clouds and break down how, rain clouds form, why do they turn into, storm clouds, why does it rain at a specific time, what is the composition of the cloud at the specific time. Science can address all of these things, but that deeper why question is a realm that science cannot go into. Now, let me start off by giving you an analogy or a little thought experiment that should really get us to appreciate this point. Imagine your auntie has flown over from, I don't know, say Pakistan, right? She's flown over, she spent a month with you, you had a good time, you caught up with your auntie, and she's now leaving. But she's leaving on a day that you're not home. You are at university, you have exams going on, so you couldn't give your farewell to her. You couldn't say goodbye to her. Now, your auntie loves baking cakes, right? So as a way of showing you she loves you and she really cares about you, she bakes you a beautiful chocolate cake, right? A really nice, beautiful chocolate cake, and she leaves it on the table and she leaves for her flight. You come home that evening, you come through the door, and immediately as you walk through the door, you pick up on this smell of beautifully baked chocolate, a chocolate cake. You're hungry, you go in and you look on the table and there's this amazing cake on the table. Now, the slide that you may be looking at, or you may refer to when I'm making this point, brothers and sisters, on that cake it says, I love you. But imagine this cake doesn't have anything written on it. It's just a really nice chocolate cake with all of these amazing fillings and everything, and this cream topping on top of it and all of this stuff. But there's nothing on it. Next to the cake, there's a little note. And on that note, you pick up the note, you open the note, and the note reads, to my dear nephew, I love you, just baked this cake for you to tell you how much I appreciate you, and I will see you soon. Okay? Now this tells you why your auntie left the cake on the table, or why that cake exists on the table right now. It's because your auntie is leaving, she's going to miss you, she wanted you to know how much she appreciated you, so she baked you this beautiful chocolate cake. Now, what do you decide to do? Recently, you've been bitten by the science bug, right? So you're hungry, and what you do is you probably eat a slice of the cake, and the rest of the cake, what you decide to do for some strange reason, hypothetically speaking, is you take this cake back to your university, to the science lab, because you want to know everything you can know about the cake. So you give it to the science technician and you say to him, look, here is a cake. I want you to tell me everything you can about the cake, everything you can. And you have a month to do this. Study this cake, tell me everything you can. And you leave the cake with the technician. A month later, you receive a report via email. And you were waiting for this report. It's to do with the cake that you left at the science lab. Now, when you open this report, you see that it's quite an extensive report and it covers loads of things. So I want you to think about this, brothers and sisters. What sort of things will the report cover? Remember, you said to the scientist, tell me everything you can about the cake. Now, what can the scientist tell you? What would you expect to find in this report? Maybe things like the density of the cake, the raw ingredients of the cake, the age of the raw ingredients of the cake, what temperature the cake was baked at, how many eggs were used, what type of flour was used, and so on. So all of these things that science can tell you about. So you'll find a list of all of these things, maybe even the amount of the certain ingredients that were used in the cake and all of these types of things. But here's the question. Would you find somewhere in the report where it says why the cake was baked? The answer is no, because science cannot address the why question. Why did the cake exist in the first place? Why was it baked? That why question cannot be addressed by science. No matter how much the scientists study that cake, they will never be able to tell you why the cake was baked. In other words, the information that was on that little note that your auntie left you, she baked the cake for you because she loves you and she's going to miss you. That piece of information is beyond the scope of science. And obviously you didn't give that piece of paper to the scientists. They don't have that access to that knowledge, that information. So without that, they can never tell you why the cake was baked in the first place. But they can tell you everything else about the cake. You know, the hows of the cake. So there is a distinction between the why and the how. John Lennox, in one of his books, he put it in another beautiful way, where he tried to highlight the distinction between the how and the why. And he basically said, you know, imagine, I think something along the lines of, and I'm stealing his example and probably paraphrasing it and putting it in my own way. But he said, look, imagine you come to my house and you walk through the door and you notice that the kettle is boiling, right? Why is the kettle boiling? This is a question. Now, there's two levels or two ways you can ask this why question. One is the how why type of question, and one is the why type of question. The answer to the how why type of question is, well, the kettle is boiling is because the kettle is plugged into the mains, the switch is on, the button has been pressed, therefore the electricity is traveling through the wire, which is leading to the coil within the kettle to heat up. And as the coil is heating up, this is raising the temperature of the water, and eventually the water gets to boiling point and the water is boiling. That's why the kettle is boiling. That's the how why type of answer. You know, how it's doing this, how the kettle is boiling. Why is the kettle boiling? The why type of question, the answer to that is beyond the scope of science. Well, it's boiling because I wanted to make a cup of tea. That's why the kettle is boiling. So there's two levels of explanation in regards to physical things, as John Lennox is highlighting in his book. I believe it was The God's Undertaker, but don't quote me on that. It may have been one of his other books. But this is it's an important distinction that we need to make, that there's a how type of answer and there is a why type of answer. And the why question is a question that's beyond the scope of science. It can't answer that question. It can only answer the how question. Now, just because science can't delve into the realm of the why, it doesn't now logically follow that there is no why type of answer. And therefore, now if we reflect upon this a bit deeper, you know, when we do the science, when scientists study the physical world around us, and say, for example, going back to the example of the rain clouds, we study rain clouds. Sure, we may be able to understand the how, why type of question and engage with that. How do the rain clouds form? What are the base composition of rain clouds and all of these things? But why do they exist in the first place? You know, what is the source and the cause behind their existence? The source and cause behind all of the laws that are required for rain clouds to form and to be elevated in mid-air, essentially. That why answer question is not a scientific question. It's more of a metaphysical type of question. And that's beyond the scope of science. So science is limited to the how things work, or the why how type of question, as opposed to the why type of question, if you like. So this is another limitation of the scientific method. Another limitation is that it cannot address some metaphysical questions, such as the nature of causal links. And we require an understanding of causal links in the scope of science, in the discipline of science. Consciousness, as we've already touched upon, right? Another thing is we can even say other metaphysical questions like the ultimate meaning of life. Not the meaning of life as far as the meaning in life or the meaning we give our lives. I'm specifically referring to the ultimate meaning of life. This is not an empirical question. This is not a scientific question. I would even argue this is not a philosophical question to a great extent, because the ultimate meaning of life cannot be determined by humans because we didn't bring ourselves into existence. So therefore, as Muhammad Asad put it in The Crossroads to Islam, I believe his book, this is a religious question. This is a question for revelation. This is not a question for philosophy or science per se. So science is limited from this perspective. It cannot address metaphysical questions. Another limitation of science based on this very thing is something we spoke about earlier on in this course when we spoke about self-evident truths. We know that there are some self-evident truths, some first principles that science needs to acknowledge for us to do science in the first place. Now, these things cannot be proven by science, such as one of the things, if we refresh our memories, was we have to assume before we do science as a self-evident truth or a first principle or a basic belief, whichever way we want to refer to it, or as an axiom, that the external world exists, the external world is real. We can't prove this scientifically, right? Remember I mentioned that, I can ask you, how can you prove this? You may say, well, I can touch the table, I can smell the books on the bookshelf, I can taste the chair that I'm sitting on, although that's really strange, but you can say this, right? So we can touch, taste, feel, and do these things. And therefore we can prove that the world outside, the external world to our minds, actually exists. But then again, if we stop and think about this, how do you know that what you're touching, tasting, and feeling isn't just, these sensations aren't just being stimulated in your mind, in your brain, which your brain is in a vat on another planet, and these aliens or these beings are sticking probes into your mind, making you feel like you're here and making you experience what you experience and believe your experiences are real. So in other words, how can you disprove that you're in the matrix? You can't. However, we don't believe that, We start with the base assumption, the self-evident truth that the real world exists. And we need to start, and this is integral to science as well. It's one of the base assumptions, the axioms that we need to begin with. However, science itself is limited from this perspective because it cannot prove these things. So that highlights another limitation of science. Now we're going to take a break here, brothers and sisters. I want you to really think about the ideas that we've discussed and make those distinctions, especially as far as the how and the why, and some of understanding that science can't address certain metaphysical questions, it can't address some of its own base assumptions. And when you're ready, move on to the next section.